All right, good morning, everyone. We are on page 215. We are going to begin to learn the laws of Hatmanah. Hatmanah means to insulate. As we'll see, there are some prohibitions against insulation. The question is, what is included in insulation? When we use the word insulate, we could be referring to a lot of things. Is a person allowed to use a thermos on Shabbos? Is a person allowed to cover let's say you have something hot and you want to cover it? Are you allowed to go ahead and do so? What is allowed? What is not allowed? We're going to begin that discussion today. We're not going to finish it, but we'll start and then we'll pick up and figure out some practical applications, more practical applications as time goes on. Okay, so let's begin on page 215. Says the Mishnah Emeseches Shabbos. Safek chashecha, safek ein chashecha. It is in a situation where there is uncertainty whether it is night or not yet night. So that is another way of saying what we call bein hashmashos, which means literally between the suns or between the bodies in the sky, which we call another word for twilight. Between sunset and nightfall, that time is called a safek, right? Meaning we don't know, is this called day, right? The sun has gone down, but it's still not dark yet. So is that day? Is that night? We call that safek. That is the time of doubt. We treat it stringently, generally speaking. In other words, Shabbos begins the latest at sunset, right? Because we treat it stringently, but there are a number of leniencies that we'll see throughout the laws of Shabbos regarding that time between sunset and nightfall. Okay, there are a number of leniencies that apply during that time frame because although we treat it as night, it's still light, a little bit of light outside, right? Even after the sun goes down, there's still some light in the sky, and therefore there are some leniencies. So one of those leniencies is like this. So the Mishnah says that in that twilight time, ein ma'asrin es avadai, you don't tithe crops, okay, not so relevant to us. Vein matbilin es hakelim, you're also not allowed to immerse utensils to make them usable. The idea when you immerse a utensil, you're changing its status. You can't change something's status on Shabbos. You're also not allowed to change the status once it's sunset. So if you're running late, you're like, oh, I have that new pot I wanted to use as a serving dish on Shabbos. It's past sunset. I can't go and immerse it in a mikvah.
Didn't you say you could make ice, though? Isn't that changing its status?
Because some argue that you are allowed to make ice because they argue it's not changing its status. In other words, although, meaning to your point, making a bowl, it looks like the same bowl before, but halachically it's just radically changed between usable and unusable, or as water to ice, there are those who argue it's the same thing. Okay. The eimad likinas aneros, you can't light the candles. That's why we light the candles, obviously, before sunset, ideally 18 minutes before sunset, what we call candle lighting time. And valma asrin es hadmai, you are allowed to give tithes for something called demai. Demai is a category of produce which you're not sure if it was tithed or not, so it's a less radical, dramatic change. Uma arvin, and you're allowed to set up an eruv, okay? And here's the key line: vithomnin esachamin, and during that time you're allowed to insulate hot water. Okay, you're allowed to insulate hot water at the time of bein hashmashos. Okay, during that time, you're allowed to insulate hot water. As we're about to see, there are two types of insulations. One is where you maintain, and one is an insulation which actually increases the temperature, okay? So, as we'll see in a second, this insulation we're talking about over here is during bein hashmashos, during between, after sunset, before nightfall, you're allowed to insulate in a way that maintains a certain temperature. So let's turn the page and see what Rashi has to say about this. Look at source 2 on page 216. V'tomnin esachamin, nosnan bekupa shel mochin. You're allowed to place them you're allowed to place the food within a basket of soft material. Lios chomim mishtamer v'hem, bless you. In order to preserve the heat, aval mishechashecha, once it's nightfall, vaday ein tomnin bahen, you are certainly not allowed to insulate at that time. Okay, so after, let's say you lit your Shabbos candles at the appropriate time, and then you say, I wanted to go ahead and wrap my soup with some material to maintain the heat, and I forgot to do so. Okay, so at that point, after lighting candles, it's not yet dark outside. It's at that time of bein hashmashos. It's after sunset, but it's not yet night. It's not yet dark in the sky. I'd be allowed to wrap the soup up. Okay, fine. That's halacha number 1. Okay, let's look at source number 3. This is another Mishnah in Masechah Shabbos. Says the Mishnah, "Bameh tomnin uvameh ein tomnin." With what are you allowed to insulate a pot of cooked food, and with what are you not allowed to insulate? Lo begefes, v'lo bezevel, lo bemelach, v'lo besid, v'lo bechol, ben lachem, ben yeveshin. It gives a whole long list of different things that you are not allowed to insulate with. Solid residue of produce, okay, manure, okay, salt, lime. They used a lot of manure for a lot of things back in the day. We live in a very different society. Not in sand, whether it's moist or dry. All those things actually generate some level of heat. right? They actually they generate a certain level of heat, and therefore you are not allowed to insulate. Now, this Mishnah, the question, the comment, the Gemara itself is asking, wants to understand that the Gemara grapples with what's this? When is this Mishnah talking about? Is this talking about on Shabbos? Well, we already said you're not allowed to insulate with anything on Shabbos, right? In other words, in Perek Beis, where we quoted the source number 1 was from chapter 2, and there it said once it's Shabbos, you can't insulate. Insulate with anything. I don't care if it's feathers. I don't care if it's sand. Anything. You cannot insulate with anything at all. Now, this Mishnah says there are certain things you could insulate with and certain things you cannot insulate with. Wait a second. I thought you can't insulate at all when Shabbos begins, right? So what the Gemara, what everyone understands this to mean is that what the second Mishnah is actually inferring, we infer from the second Mishnah, is that there is actually a prohibition against insulation that begins even before Shabbos begins. Okay? There is a prohibition against insulation which takes place even before Shabbos begins. What's going on over here? What type of insulation? If you insulate in a way that actually increases the heat, okay? If you insulate with something, not something which preserves heat, but you insulate with something, these types of things, again, manure could get very hot, apparently. Very, very, very hot. So if you insulate with something which is actually going to not just preserve, keep the temperature, but actually contribute to the heat, you would not even be able to do so before Shabbos. Okay,
so different than cooking. If you're allowed, we're just talking about ben ishmashos, so
we're talking about even before ben ishmashos.
So how's that different than cooking?
So are you allowed to cook something on cooking?
You're allowed to start cooking it before Shabbos.
You are allowed to. So we'll see. The Gemara is going to address this, but basically the idea being that even before, so we have two laws. We have a law that on Shabbos itself you can't insulate with something that maintains heat. That's on Shabbos. Okay, ben ishmashos. And before, you are allowed to insulate with something that maintains heat, but before Shabbos begins, you cannot insulate with something that maintains that increases heat. Okay, so let's see what the reasons for this in the Gemara. Says the Gemara in source number 4. Amar Rava mipnei ma amru ein tomnim bedavar she'eino mosef hevel mishechashecha. Why is it that you are not allowed to insulate with something that does not increase heat? Okay, once Shabbos begins, right? There is if it's something which does not increase heat, you are not allowed to do so after nightfall. Why? Gezerah shema yartiach. There's a concern that a person might come to boil the pot. Okay, in other words, a person may go ahead. They're about to insulate their pot, like, oh my gosh, it got cold. In other words, if I'm not interacting with my food, I'm not going to be thinking about my food. But once I start insulating, that means I'm intent on maintaining the heat. And if I start wrapping and I'm like, oh wait, I feel the edges, doesn't feel so hot. I might go ahead and boil it. I might put it back on a fire. I might turn a fire on. In other words, as long as I'm not really engaged with it, it's one thing. But if I'm actively engaged in insulation, which means I am concerned with maintaining a certain temperature, so there's a concern once that's on my mind, I may go ahead and say, it's not hot enough, and go and put it back on a fire, which would be prohibited, right? Once it's dark. I can't do that once it's dark. Ask the Gemara, if that's the case, we're at the top of page 217 now. Bein hashmashos nami nigzar. Then why is it that we learned in our Mishnah that during twilight, I am allowed to insulate, right? The Mishnah said, I'm allowed to insulate with things which don't increase the heat at twilight. I'm not allowed to do so after twilight, at nightfall. But if the concern is I'm going to go ahead and start cooking, are you allowed to cook during twilight? Absolutely not. So why don't we also decree during twilight? Amrale, Abaye answers, Stam kederos roschos hein. Because when you begin Shabbos, the way we have a lot of appliances that are able to stay on Shabbos, and we keep them on and they're going to stay on for hours. Back in the day, very often what they would do is they would put something on the fire, then right before Shabbos, they'd extinguish the fire, right? So right before Shabbos, right at twilight, your food is presumably piping hot, because they just turn off the ovens, they just turn off the elements. But if it's already a little bit after that, it's already at nightfall, 40 minutes later, whatever it's going to be, then there's much more of a concern that at that point the heat got too low, and you might be the person who is starting to insulate. Well, wait a second, I want it to be hotter, and they may, in their frantic concern or whatever it is, they may go ahead and put it back on an existing fire or light a new fire, and that would be problematic. Right? So in other words, like this. So we're saying that
it's not the insulation itself, it's the act.
It's exactly. Very good. Thank you. It's not the act of insulation. If I am not adding heat, if my insulation is just maintaining heat, it's not the act of insulation itself. But what it represents is a person who is concerned about their food. So if it's before Shabbos and they're concerned about their food, That's fine. There's no issue over here. If it's bein hashmashos, we're not concerned that a person will be concerned about their food because typically at twilight your food is still piping hot. But after nightfall, that's already a good, maybe an hour after you lit, right? Your food might be cooling off. And you're insulating, the people are coming a little bit late. Let me go and wrap the chicken soup because I just heard that I heard from a friend that they got delayed at their house, not going to come for another hour. Oh, I'm concerned. I'm going to start wrapping it. I feel it's a little bit warm. I might get nervous and I might go ahead and put it on the fire. And therefore, I'm not allowed to insulate with items, even if it doesn't increase the heat on Shabbos. With me? Right? Okay. We still haven't defined, and we will define a little bit, what is the parameters of what insulation is. In other words, we're leaving that vague right now. We'll come back to that question. But the point is that after Shabbos begins, if you have food, we're not talking about food on a fire, which we'll get to in a moment, but food off the fire, and you're like, hey, it's cooling off. I want to go and insulate it. So once Shabbos begins, I would not be allowed to start wrapping it in towels once Shabbos begins. Right? That would be prohibited. Good? Okay. So says the Gemara further in source number 5 on page 217. Yes.
When Shabbos begins, you can wrap it in. Towels are considered something you can't wrap it in at Bein Hashmashos?
Bein Hashmashos you could. Sorry, let me say it more clearly. At nightfall, correct. At Bein Hashmashos, that's after sunset, you would be allowed to, but at nightfall, you would not be allowed to start wrapping things in towels. Okay. Said in source number 5. Amar Rava. Mipnei ma amru ein tomim medaber hamosif hevel va'afil mod yom. Right. This one was even more interesting. What's the concern about wrapping in something that increases heat while it's still day? In other words, right, this is the one that's even harder. Answers the Gemara, Gzera shema yatmin beremetz sheyesh ba gachelas. There's a concern that you might go ahead and insulate in hot ashes. Okay, Amrle Abaye v'yatmin. What's the problem with doing so? Gezerah shema yechata begechalim. There's a concern if I insulate with something with hot ashes. The concern is that I might go ahead and start stoking those ashes. Not before Shabbos, because that's not a problem, but if I leave something in hot ashes before Shabbos begins, there's a concern that on Shabbos I may go ahead and start stoking those ashes. That's the concern. So I'm not allowed to go ahead and insulate in anything that increases heat, even before Shabbos, not because I'm doing anything wrong on Shabbos, but there's a concern if it's in something that increases heat, and there are some of those materials that stoking them would actually be a violation of Shabbos, like ashes. If I stoke those ashes, I'm going to be inflaming a fire, and that would be prohibited, and therefore I cannot go ahead and insulate in anything that increases heat because of the concern that I'm going to insulate with hot ashes, and hot ashes, there's a concern I might go ahead and stoke those ashes.
So it's only when the food's off the fire. Because if it's on the fire, then the flame itself is increasing the temperature.
Right, and that would be so. Well, we're going to jump ahead with what you're saying. So let's talk.
It's on a blech. It's under. You're on a blech.
Let's say it's on a blech. So meaning.
And there's a flame under it.
Let me say this halacha one more time, and then I think I'll address your question. In other words, so. Right now, the case number 1 was I have something off a fire, and what we're being taught is that after twilight, I'm not allowed to wrap it with a towel. Straightforward, okay. But now we're saying that even before Shabbos begins, I'm not allowed to insulate in something that increases heat. Now the Gemara says, why not? Like sand. Like what's the problem with putting it in sand before Shabbos? What's the issue? The issue is that in the general category, of things that increase heat, one of the things in that category is ashes. Okay? And ashes are something that if you stoke those ashes, you could go, like fiery ashes, you could go ahead and start a fire or increase a fire, which is a full-fledged biblical prohibition. And therefore, because of that, and the rabbis were therefore concerned, and therefore said anything that increases heat, I'm not allowed to insulate in those items, because some of those items might be items that on Shabbos I would go ahead and increase the heat. Okay, so it's a little bit convoluted, but do you understand? Do you hear what's going on? So let's now apply that. So you just mentioned, and we're going to come back to this and discuss this in more detail. If I have something on a hot plate, okay, let's forget a fire. I have something on a hot plate, and I wrap it up on top of a hot plate. Now the wrap is a towel. A towel doesn't insulate, right? But together with what's on the bottom and the insulation on top, the towel that I just went ahead and wrapped it with, now there is an insulation which is increasing heat, because the blech beneath, or the hot plate beneath, is adding heat, and it's insulated. So this would actually be an example, and we'll see the practical applications, of something where I cannot insulate even before Shabbos I can't go ahead. I have chicken soup on my blech. And I'm afraid my blech's not going to get hot enough. I want to keep my chicken soup piping hot because we like it piping hot. It's the winter and we're eating on the sukkah. I don't know, whatever it is. So I go ahead and before Shabbos, I take some towels. I take a towel and I wrap it around the chicken soup. That would be prohibited based on this. Why? Because it now falls in the category of hatmanah, of insulation, in a scenario which increases heat. Now you might say, wait, the blech.
Crock-pot does the same thing.
Well,
Crock-pot surrounds it and covers it.
Good. We'll come back to we haven't yet defined what hatmanah is, so we'll have to come back to why a crockpot is not that problem, according to most, although there are some who disagree, but according to most, we'll come back to that. But generally, we'll see. Don't leave yet before I confuse you all. There's a couple of questions. I'm going to go from the back to the front, because I think okay, go ahead.
If you have a hot water urn and you're concerned that the water is not going to be hot enough
Yeah.
for Shabbos,
Yeah.
so then you shouldn't be able to put a towel, wrap it
Correct.
around
Correct.
hot water.
Correct.
Or,
Correct.
They sell these blankets that you put on top of hot, so you can't use that on Shabbos.
It depends on the type. I will, as we'll see soon. Like I had one of those growing up, okay, but it was like very porous. It was extremely porous. It had like big holes in it, so it had like some. Okay, and we'll see. We're going to get into like how covered it has to be. You have a question? Yeah.
So my question is though, is an oven that's closed, right, will add heat? Let's say you turn off the oven before Shabbos.
So we have to define what hatmanah is. Yes, we haven't defined. So again, I know this is confusing. There's a couple of pieces we have to get in. But let's get the general principle. But is an oven, is a crock pot, foil, tin foil, a thermos. We're going to get into all that today. Yes.
So if the purpose of having the blech in the first place is to remind you not to cook coals.
Yes.
So why, if you have something on top of blech, wouldn't the blech serve the purpose
Cor-
of reminding you not
Right.
to cook?
So this is where it gets confusing because let's go back to sand. Okay. If that's I want to focus on sand for a second.
Besides the fact that the whole idea that sand adding heat is
Okay, let's just accept it for a second. Okay, I don't know. I'm not you're good. I don't know if there's scientists here. Okay, but let's just accept it for a second. If I put something in sand, I can stoke the sand all I want. It's not going to increase the heat, right? The Rav is saying that there's two categories of hatmanah. There's two categories of insulation. There's insulation which maintains, insulation which increases. Once I'm in the category of increasing, even if in that particular scenario there's no biblical concern. Because I could stoke the sand all I want, I could move it around, nothing's going to happen. But since in that general category of insulation that increases heat, there is a case where it's problematic, i.e. insulation and hot ashes, therefore everything in that category is going to be included. So that's why, in the case of your hot plate, I'm allowed to put something directly on it, but it doesn't matter. Since it's in the hatmanah category, yeah.
Sorry, so why not, I'm not making halacha, why not just osir things that you can't stoke? So like ashes, why not just be
Yeah.
osir ashes, things that you might actually come to stoke it, but if it's just not, I'm
I-
not understanding how the division.
Again, I could have heard it that way. I hear you. If I'd be like the person in charge, and then I would categorize it that way. But I could also hear that Chazal basically said, no, there's two categories. Conceptually, people think of, and you have to keep in mind, insulation in the ancient world is far more common than it is nowadays. We don't insulate so much because we are spoiled. We have all these heating elements. But presumably, I'm going to conjecture, presumably in people's minds, there was understood that there was insulation of maintenance, insulation of increase. And therefore, it was too confusing, presumably, to go ahead and say, okay, these types of insulation that increase, problematic. These types of insulation that increase, not problematic. No, general category of insulation that increases. And until Mashiach comes, we're stuck with some of these decrees.
Just, do you mind my argument? Because
Please.
it would make almost more sense to say the reason for not increasing is that you might add it on Shabbos and you should increase the heat on Shabbos, which in itself is its own problem. But that's not what it's saying at all.
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's it.
With me?
And why would a towel be an increase instead of a maintenance?
So a towel on its own is a maintenance. If I take my chicken soup off the fire and I wrap it with a towel, that just maintains it. But if the towel where it's placed, now just what I was mentioning the blech, if it's sitting on the elements, right, and I wrap it now, right, then although the towel itself is not increasing, but it's in a place where the towel is maintaining the heat that's increasing, that's a case of Mosif Hevel. That's a case of increasing heat.
It's helping the heat maintain.
Exactly. It's acting together with it, okay? Good? We're wrapping our heads around this? Just kidding. Okay, fine. Let's go. Okay, so here he goes. Let's see how the Shulchan Aruch rules over here. Page 219, source 8. Says the Shulchan Aruch, we're skipping a page over here because we're skipping a page. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Ein tomnim b'Shabbos. You are not allowed to insulate on Shabbos. Afilu b'davar she'ein mosif hevel, even with something that does not add heat. Right? So on Shabbos itself, you cannot use a towel to wrap something off the fire, right? You took it off the fire, even if it doesn't increase heat. Aval b'safik chashecha tomnim bo. But during the time of twilight, you are allowed to insulate if it doesn't increase heat. Vein tomnim b'davar hamosif havel afilu miba'od yom, and you are not allowed to insulate with something that increases heat even on Erev Shabbos, even before Shabbos begins. Okay? Fine. That's the short summary of what we just learned. And now let's turn to source 10, where he kind of outlines in a little bit more detail. There's a more of a contemporary book and summarizes the ruling. So Inyan Hatmanah, what is the concept of Hatmanah, which means insulation, hu she'otef es hagdera sheba munach hatafshel, is to wrap the pot in which a cooked food is placed, o es hatafshel atma, or to wrap or to cover the cooked food itself, al menas lishmor eschomo, in order to maintain, olahosif alav, or to add heat. Okay? V'nisbar b'Gemara, and the Gemara clarifies, we're on page 220, sheyesh lahavchin be'isra hatmana ben shtei gezeres chalukos, that there is a distinction, you could distinguish between two separate decrees. For each decree, there is a separate reason. Okay, number one, Isser Hatmanah b'davar hamosif hevel. There is a prohibition against insulating with something that increases heat. V'hainu, and this means she'asr la'atof es hagdera b'chomer hamosif al choma. It is forbidden to wrap something, to insulate something with a substance which increases or adds heat. Tam Isser Zen is Sparish B'Gemara. The reason for this decree is mentioned in the Gemara. Shehu Mishum Gezerah, because of a decree, Shema Yatmin Beremetz Sheyesh Bo Gacheles, that a person may go ahead and insulate with ashes that contain coals. Okay, let's skip the brackets. Parentheses, Vim Yasakain, and if a person does so, Chayshinan, there's a concern, Shem Yechat B'Gachalim, they may go ahead and stoke the coals. V'kiven Sheshorasha Isser Hu Michshash Shema Yechat B'Gachalim. Okay, and since the concern is that I might go ahead and stoke the coals, L'chein Asru Af Shehitman Es Hagder Me'erev Shabbos. Okay, so we're concerned that I might go ahead and do so. Therefore, they prohibited even doing so before Shabbos begins. Because the mere fact, because once it's insulated on Shabbos, something that adds heat creates a concern that a person may stir the coals. Okay, that's number one. Then there's the second prohibition, the lighter prohibition of insulating with something that does not increase heat. This means this is a scenario where a person, it's forbidden to insulate with a substance which does not increase the heat. It just maintains the heat. Tam Isser Zeh, the reason for this, Nisparish B'Gemara Shemishum Shechashu Chazal, that our sages were concerned, Shema B'Shashi Yava Adam L'Thatmanes Hagdera, that when the person starts engaging in insulating the pot, Yematze Shekvar Nitzdanana, they find that it started cooling off. And since they're now concerned or involved in a hot utensil, they might mistakenly go ahead and cook this item. This prohibition of insulation with something which does not increase heat, lo nesser el b'Shabbos atzma, it is only prohibited on Shabbos itself. Ach rishai latminas der me'erev Shabbos, you are allowed before Shabbos begins to insulate b'davar she'eino mosif hevel with something which does not increase heat. Over here, the main concern is at the time of insulation. Shaz alul harsiach es hagdera. That's when you're concerned that you're going to go ahead and start heating it up. Since the concern is I might do something when I'm looking at it, there's no concern on Erev Shabbos. Okay? Making sense? Ish? Okay, let's again just review the principles. Principles are that on Shabbos itself, there's two concerns over here. One is the concern that when I'm engaged in something, that I might go ahead, something that I want to be hot, and I start looking at and playing, dealing with it, and see it's not hot, I might go ahead and heat it up. Okay, because of this, the rabbis came along and said, on Shabbos, I can't go ahead and, on Shabbos after Bein HaShmashos, meaning during the twilight area, there's no concern because we assume it's really hot at that point. But after Shabbos begins, after nightfall, okay, which is a little while after candlelighting, I'm not allowed to go and wrap my soup with towels. Why? Because I might go ahead and heat it up. Right? Because I realize, oh, it's not hot as hot as I want it to be, and I'm now dealing with it, right? If the fact that I want to wrap it shows that I'm concerned about it. And that concern may lead me to go ahead and cook it. Therefore, I'm not allowed to wrap my soup that's off the fire with towels on Shabbos. Before Shabbos, I'm allowed to do so. Why? Because the only concern is that as I'm looking at it, I'm like, oh, it's not hot enough. So guess what? Before Shabbos, fine, put it on the fire, no problem, right? And therefore, before Shabbos, if I took my pot off the fire and I want to go ahead and I wrap it up with towels, no problem. No problem, right? So let's say sometimes, don't want to keep any of our elements on in our house, right? We want to turn off all the fires, whatever it is, and so we turn the fire off right before Shabbos, take the soup off the fire, we'll wrap it all up in towels, no problem. It's off the fire, no problem whatsoever.
But if you
Right?
move it off the flame on the black. But
So if it's in the place where it's not Yad
it's
Lettuce
still
Bow,
warm, right, it's still warm.
so if it's a place, I believe if it's a place where it's not Yad Lettuce Bow, I'll try to confirm next week. Believe in a place Yad Lettuce Bow, it's not a problem. But on the place, now the second decree was that a concern that I might stoke the coals. Stoking the coals is not a concern at the time of insulation. So stoking the coals is a concern that whenever it's in that situation, I may stoke the coals. So in that second category of things which increase heat, I can't even do it Erev Shabbos. Why? Because the concern isn't when I'm wrapping it. The concern is that if I leave it in this wrapping still on Shabbos, I might stoke the coals. Now, again, if I wrap it on my fire, there's no coals to stoke. Doesn't matter. It's part of that general prohibition that in anything which is most of hevel, which increases heat. If I put it in, since in some scenarios I might put it in ashes and coals, and therefore on Shabbos I might go ahead and stoke it, right? Because it's sitting in it. Therefore, I can't insulate at all, even before Shabbos, with something that increases heat. Included in that is putting something on, wrapping something which is on your blech. We'll talk about the parameters of that soon. Those are the two general principles. Okay? Yes.
I'm just thinking of something that might have bothered me else, which is the idea of something increasing heat, an object, a substance that increases heat without a source.
You're saying, how could something like that happen?
No, so I'm just thinking about it, but I don't know if it's bothering you, that question bothers anybody else. But-
Yeah,
So I'm just thinking, there are certain materials that can get hot to a point where they're hotter than, or at least the same temperature or hotter than the soup itself, and then they would be, as opposed to like a blanket, which doesn't really,
Generate any further heat.
yeah, exactly.
Right, that makes sense. That's
Because of its material.
right. So then it's going to start contributing to the heat of the pot itself. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Yes.
So the difficulty is, we live in a modern world,
Mm-hmm.
and how do you apply these principles
Yes.
in this circumstance? Because in this world, it doesn't make sense, because we're not putting pots in ashes where we can stoke the
You could.
Turn on.
I every year I get shilas every summer from a bunch of people who go camping on Shabbos. They're out of their mind going camping at all. I don't know about you, my back would be like broken if I'd go camping. But the point is that I don't know. This comes up, right? So granted, you and I, it's not so relevant. We'll have to figure out how to apply it, but it's not like it doesn't exist. I understand your point. But
I mean, like on a day-to-day, on a special circumstance, when you're camping,
Right.
for 2 weeks, and you're gonna have Shabbat, on the campsite.
Right.
This is a very legitimate
right.
prohibition.
Yes.
Because that's how you're living. You're living in this more primitive environment.
Right.
That's not fair.
No.
But how do you, there. How do you apply this?
So I think if I could, let me make sure I understand. I don't think you're asking the question, how do you apply it, the application, but the question is like, is it a fair decree in the modern world? I think is what you're saying politely. So meaning, which is a very fair question. So very briefly, I think it's an important thing to just highlight. I think we've spoken about it a little bit in the past, like years ago, like in this setting. But the decrees, we live in, from a Jewish legal perspective, we live in a broken world. What that means is that in the times that, in the idealized world of Jewish law and Judaism in general, we have something called a Sanhedrin, which is able to make decrees and break decrees, start new decrees, and then change decrees, and that's what they do. But we live in a world post-destruction of the temple, right? And pre-rebuilding of a temple. And in this broken world, that's what, from a Jewish perspective, it's a broken world. I don't think you need from Jewish to say it's a broken world. But from a Jewish perspective, there are certain things which are kind of frozen in time. Okay? Meaning that the law is basically from the time after the Talmud was the last remnant of a time where there was broad consensus about anything. And even in the Talmud, you argue, what are you talking about? There's no consensus. But there really is. The way it's structured is, it gives a basic direction of consensus. Everyone is codified in one book. But since for the past 1,500 years, there hasn't been anything which even replicates in any way the Sanhedrin. Every once in a while, some maverick says, well, we're going to make a new Sanhedrin, and it's an absolute flop and failure because no one's able to bring a bunch of rabbis together to all agree to sit on one board and make decisions. Not happening, not happening. Okay, it's just a reality. We could lament it. It's a reality. And the bottom line is, there is no Sanhedrin. And so the reality is that at the times of Mashiach, we believe, and some don't spell it out this way, that many of the decrees that we have today will change. Some in this way and some in that way. In other words, some we need more stringencies. Maybe there'll be some decrees about, how often during the day you're allowed to use your cell phone. That'd be a good decree. I would like that. It's too much, right? And at the same time, some things like this, Hatmanah of this sort, it's probably on the on the list of things that they'll be like, okay, in modern appliances, it would not apply. But we are handicapped because we do not have a Supreme Court. We do not have the ability to change these things. And so, which is, by the way, a testimony to the incredible tenacity of the Jewish people that were able to hold on to a system which we know is somewhat broken, but Zemashiyesh, it's all we have. We're stuck. Rebbetzin Shani Terragan, there's certain laws, certain certain restrictions that the Talmud tells us regarding family purity that the women accepted upon themselves. Okay, but it's a lot of stringencies. It wasn't imposed by the rabbis. The Gemara says the women decided on their own. This is the stringency, and it becomes codified in law because they all accepted it. And a number of stringencies. She says first thing when Mashiach comes, I'm going to the front of the line, and I'm going to ask the Sanhedrin to we're done. Maybe my great grandmother wanted this. We don't want this. We're done. Right. So the point is that we're stuck. We're broke. It's broken. So those questions are legitimate questions. I would conjecture, imagine that many of the things, the rabbinic decrees, they can't change biblical things. Rabbinic decrees in a perfected world, in a world of Sanhedrin, would change. But Zemashiyesh, we're kind of stuck with this, with those decrees. And when we get stuck with it, I think to me, yes, sometimes it's frustrating. At the same time, it's pretty incredible that we're kind of holding on, saying, it's a reminder, that things that are broken need to change. And at the same time, reminds us of okay, we held on to something for so long. It's pretty cool, I think. Anyway, okay. Make sense? I hope. Okay, let's go a little further. Here's where it gets very, very important to address a lot of the questions you were asking. So source 11, okay, says the Shulchan Aruch on page 221. Losum kelim ala tafshil, to place a utensil around food, kidei l'shamro min achbarim, to guard it from mice, a common issue in the ancient world, right? They had mice all over the place, right? O kidei shelo yistanef ba'frorios, or so that it doesn't become dirty. Shari, that is allowed. She'ein zeh kimatme lahachem, that is not doing insulation for the purpose of warming. Ela kishomer, you're just protecting it. Venosin kisla kedera, it's like placing a lid on the pot. Okay, so this is a very important halacha that the Shulchan Aruch tells us. Your intention, okay, and your genuine intention plays a role in what's considered Hatmanah or not. Why am I placing this cover? Right, so let's now fast forward a few hundred years to the next source, which is written in the modern era, a few years ago. Says the Orach HaShabbos, he writes, Michseh HaKedera, the cover of a pot, Eino Nidon Katmana, that's not insulation, Af Im Hu Nogea Ba'ochel, even if it's touching the food directly, De'ikra Matarasa Lishmor Za'ochel Ne'lichluch, the reason you cover a pot, even when it's, is basically, you're just protecting its protection. Okay, you may say it's meant to maintain the heat, or increase the heat. But I'll give you an example. When let's say you put something in your fridge, right? So so sometimes I put on Shabbos, it happens sometimes there's dishes that they're already in a fancier dish. I don't want to put them back in the pot, so I put it back in the fridge. So I don't know what you do. I'll take something and I'll cover it, right? It's not trying to keep cold thing. I just don't want if my kid goes ahead and takes the orange juice out of the fridge and spills some orange juice in the potato salad, it's going to not taste good. So I cover it. I put a cover, right? So a cover is standard procedure to protect it. You're right. It also maintains heat and increases heat, but standard procedures, you have a pot, you put a cover in it, right? If a person placed food that was not inside a covered pot on an urn, okay, one's allowed to cover that thing on the urn with one cover. It's not insulation, rather it's a cover because of dirt that goes on food. Okay, so here's a very important principle, right? He says one cover is considered cover, not insulation. And therefore, you're allowed to surround any food item Benir aluminum foil, and to place it on something hot, Okay, we're talking about before Shabbos. Ach ein la'otzvo b'shichvos muyuteres. You should not wrap it in additional things, shalnir aluminium, with extra layers of aluminum foil. Mikivan shehashichva chitzona, the outer layer, ein an echutza l'tzorach shmiras ha'ochel melichloch, is not needed to keep it clean. Elanases shmiras ha'chom, that's made for heat. V'havi hatmana, and that's hatmana. So basically, the first layer is free. That's what we're learning over here. Think of every item we have is, so let's say an item that's in a pot, you're allowed to put the cover on, that's not considered hatmana. You're allowed to cover something with one wrap of foil. That's not considered hatmana. That's just called covering it, right? You don't put a piece of chicken in your fridge, or if you want to heat up a piece of chicken, you don't put it like on something directly, you'll cover it. So any single cover is not going to be hatmana. It's only when you get to cover number 2 that you run into a question of hatmana. Yes.
So I'm thinking if you have like a regular foil pan and you put foil on the top of it,
Mhm.
cover it, is that the same thing as you seem to imply that you would put in like a whole layer of foil from the bottom all the way around? Is that also okay? Because I wouldn't usually do that just to cover it. That would be like I would usually cover the top, but
Yeah.
not the whole thing.
Right. So because meaning he's talking about if I cover the food item all the way around,
So the food I can cover, but not the pot.
if I cover once I cover any pot with a second layer, right? First layer is free. First layer is by definition.
If you have foil.
So I can't. If I put foil on the bottom, that's already hatmana.
That's already too much.
Correct. If I just put the cover on top, that's fine, right? Because that's a cover. So, right? So basically over here, there's a huge distinction, which makes a big difference halachically, right? So anytime I have anything I just cover, that is not called hatmana, that's called covering. When I go for the second layer, that's when it's problematic. Yes?
So it's a problem though, because like I was in Airbnb and we double or triple wrapped everything on shop, like right before shop.
Yeah.
So I didn't even.
Well, again, depends what you did. If you put it on the fire, off the fire, what the scenario was.
I
But
turned off the oven. It was on Shabbos mode, but it was.
yeah, if the oven's off, then it's not mosif choms. That's fine. You did hatmana before Shabbos.
Because it's hot right before Shabbos. It is adding.
I'm not sure if it's not something that could be something has to be something that could be it's hot then, but it's constantly diminishing. Something which can't be it's something which I don't think that'd be a problem. I don't think that'd be a problem because it's not something which is by definition most of hevel. It's something which is like decreasing hevel. I believe that would be fine. And let me double check that. If it's
Like in a fleshik where it's double wrapped, right?
Yeah.
And then the oven is on Shabbos.
if it's on, yeah, that would be problem. Any double wrapping would be problematic on Shabbos.
Even
Correct.
if the intent is
To protect
to
it.
protect.
Correct, because but definitionally, it's
Like
seen as hatmana. It's seen as like it's extra. I mean, that's the whole point of part of the point of double wrap. Well, not really, but okay, it's a fair question. You're saying because at the end of the day, we see intention makes a difference. I'm not, I don't actually love the heading because I never saw it as intention. I saw it more as there's a definitional idea. One is by definition, one cover is cover, second cover is hatmana. But your point, but if they're correct that it's really about intention, then when I do a double covering, milchik, fleshig, or treif, okay, let me look into it. Okay, so I have a few questions to get back to all next week. Yeah.
Okay, so talking about an oven on Shabbos mode, so if you turn off an oven, there's no increase in heat, it's just hot. But if you have the oven on and you're not increasing the temperature, you close the door before Shabbos.
So we'll talk about.
It's not considered hatmanah because you're not increasing the heat, and it's on an element that's making it hotter and it's enclosed in that. It's not like I'm not.
So let's say the oven's off. Let's keep it simple. The oven's off.
That's one situation. But if the oven's on, which I know people do, in fact, I think I asked you that once, to put it in the oven before Shabbos and have it on in specific temperature, isn't that hatmanah to have it in the oven? Even?
So oven by definition is not hatmana because the oven is just like this is the door, this is the cover. Meaning that's the same way that we look at the pot itself as not being hatmana, even though a pot is made for two reasons: one, to hold your stuff together, and B, to preserve and maintain heat. An oven also has that, but again, an oven is an oven. It's not seen as, it's always going to be that second covering, which is going to be a hatmana issue. Okay. Yes. Sorry.
So my neighbor came over a couple weeks ago. He didn't have hot water. He needed to add it to his cholent, so he brought a thermos. So thermos.
We're going to get to
also-
thermoses. We're going to get to thermoses. We'll hold off. But yeah, but that's a very important question. Yeah.
I just like, if you have an electric stove, you turned it off,
Mm-hmm.
it's still hot.
Right.
And then
Right.
you can cover it.
Right, so I don't think so, right? That's the same, right? So I'm not, right, whether it's an oven or whether it's a stovetop, but doing hatmana on something which is already off, I believe it's okay, but I want to double check for next week. I'll get back to you all that then. Okay, so now let's get a little bit further. So far, so principle number 1 is first layer is a freebie because it's called a cover. It's not called hatmana. Second layer is where it gets problematic. But here now we have another question, and that is how much of the item has to be covered in order for it to be hatmana? right? In other words, at the end of the day, any amount of covering, let's say I'm up to the second covering, right? So I did one cover, it's my, I have my pot, okay? And then I start covering my pot, but only cover the pot partially, right? Is that going to add heat or maintain heat? Yeah, a little bit of cover has some additional, by definition, it's going to maintain some level of heat. So at what point, how much covering is considered problematic? Okay, so that's a matter of much debate. If you look at page 223, source 16, okay? So says the Shulchan Aruch, just look at that, the bold words. Aval hatmana al gabe gechalim l'divrei kol aser. Hatmana on coals is prohibited. What do I mean on coals? Wasn't hatmana being surrounded by something? And what the Shulchan Aruch over here seems to be saying is that as long as it's on something, even if it's covered in one place, that is hatmana. Hatmana is any extra layer, whether the layer is on the bottom, on the side, on the top, that's going to be hatmana. That's the Shulchan Aruch's view. Let's look at the Ramah. Keep on reading. Hagav yesh omrim da'afilu magdera omedes al gabi ha'esh mamish. Even if it's on the fire, kol zman shi megula lemala lo mikre hatmana. As long as it's uncovered atop, says the Ramah, the Ashkenazi ruling, that's not called hatmana, right? So you have the Shulchan Aruch saying any layer, any level of covering is problematic. And then you have the Ramah saying as long as it's uncovered at the top. We'll have to define exactly what the top means, but then it's not called hatmana. Okay, so the Ashkenazim are more lenient, and the Ramah saying no, if it's just covered on the bottom, that's not hatmana. As long as it's uncovered at the top, it's okay. But now there's going to be some question about what does the Ramah mean about at the top being okay. Still with me? Yeah? Says the Pri Megadim, source 17. Umahu shi'ura shekasav harav b'simen reish gimel sef aleph. What is the exact measurement that the Ramah referred to? Debe'inan dafka she'en megula lamala. That as long as it's not covered at top. I kavanaso dafka shegam pia kedera mechusa. Does he mean that only when the lid of the pot is also covered, that's when it's problematic? O dilma, or perhaps kol shekol hagdera temuna. As long as the entirety, all the sides are covered, af shepia megula, even though its cover is uncovered, hatmana have, then it is considered hatmana. In other words, when he says the top, does he mean the actual top surface, or does he mean the top part of the walls? Right? Which is the top? Because keep in mind, it's especially confusing because the Shulchan Aruch said that hatmana is even if it's at the bottom. Even if it's just at the bottom, if you place something on top of a fire, that's hatmana. The Ramah says, no. As long as the top is covered. What was he referring to? Was he saying that the case of Shulchan Aruch was talking about, where it's just covered on one side, it's fine because the sides and the top are not covered? Or did he mean, no, it could go all the way up to the sides as long as the actual cover is uncovered? You see the two possibilities? And especially in the context, it makes it a little bit more confusing. The Pri Megadim says, as long as the sides are covered, it's going to be problematic. Leaving it uncovered on one side of the top, that would still be hatmana according to the Ramah. However, if you look at source 18, okay, says the Mishnah Berurah, he says, Shehi megula, hainu michse aleha begadim milamala. As long as a person does not cover it at the top, then you're going to be okay. So the Mishnah Berurah takes the more lenient ruling and says, according to the Ramah, insulation is only when it goes all the way over the top. But if it's the three sides and the bottom, that's okay. Right? If it's the sides and the bottom, that's okay. And says the Shemir Shabbos Kol Chaso, he rules this practically. He says, Umasha amarnu she'asar lahatmin. That we said is forbidden to insulate. Eno ela alidei kisoy hakidera. That is only covering the pots. O kufsata shimurimi kol tzdadeha, from all sides. Avalim ena mechase osami kol tzdadeha. If it's not covered on all sides, ein kan mishum hatmana. There is no issue of hatmana. Umutter lasos kein afilu b'Shabbos atzma. You're allowed to cover something like this even on Shabbos itself because it's not called hatmana. If you are covering something and it's not fully covered, that is not hatmana. Okay? Again, as long as the food is fully cooked. And therefore, a person is allowed to take a covering and cover the lids of the pot with a towel, even if it's on the fire. So since the Ramah says as long as it's not covered on all sides, then it's going to be okay. So what I'm allowed to do on Shabbos is take a towel, let's say I have my chicken soup, and I put the towel on the top. It's not covering on the sides, it's just covering the top. That's fine. It's going to maintain some of the heat. It's an extra layer. It's going to cover it. That's okay. Now, it gets a little more complicated when you have everything squished together on you have a lot of guests or whatever it is, and you have all your food crowded on your hot plate. We're going to discuss that in a little bit more detail. But right now, keep it simple. You have a pot of, because maybe it's considered covered at all sides. meaning you're surrounding it by this pot and that pot and this pot and that pot, and there's the pot in the middle, and by the one in the middle is covered on all sides.
But it's not actually touching.
Good. So that's where it's going to get. We're going to get into more detail, but today we'll just focus on principles. So the principles that we're seeing over here is that to even begin the discussion of Hatmanah, it needs to be covered on all sides. Okay, and at least according to Ashkenazim, Sephardim are going to be more strict about this, and therefore according to Ashkenazim, if it's just covered at the top, even if it's on the fire, right? Until then we said if something's on a fire, like on an element, it's on your hot plate, it's on your blech, and you just put a cover on the top, that's fine. That's not called insulation. That's called putting an extra cover, but that's not called insulation. Insulation means something's covered on all sides. And the other piece we learned is that it's cover number one, which is problematic. Cover number one, which is fine. Cover number two is not. Yes?
Two questions. First of all, if you have like one of those sequoias and it leaves a few inches around the sides, if it goes down and covers the sides, it leaves a few inches, is that considered enough of a...
So we're going to address that in a split second, yeah?
Okay. The other thing is, if the reason for Hatmanah is that by dealing with the food, you might soak the coals, or you might decide to boil it, why does it matter how much you're covering it? Anything you're doing to heat up to maintain the heat of the food might get you worried about food.
Yeah, I mean, this is a general, whenever we have, a decree, there's always going to be a cutoff line of some sort. And we say, like, okay, at this point, you've already, done enough. It's like you're really invested in insulation. Now, one could have argued, well, I'm invested in insulation by doing any amount. Yeah, but you're not invested enough that it's going to be, included in that category.
Like holding back from doing the whole thing or reminding myself?
I don't know if it's, I'm not sure if you'd call it because you're reminding yourself, or it's just it's not enough in that category that we enter into that place of concern. I'm not sure if those are both the same thing. I'm not sure. Yeah. Let's just spell it out a little bit more in source on page 225, source 21. This is from Rabbi Ribiat's famous book, The Third Malachos. He says, covering even most of the surface of the hot container is permitted, as long as a significant area is left exposed. Significant in this context means an uninsulated area that is larger than what would be acceptable for insulation purposes if the restriction of Hatmanah was not a consideration. Okay, so it's a little bit subjective, but he says if someone walked in, if a person who a non-Jew who would think, what, insulation Saturday? What are you talking about, right? If you walk in and they'd see this pot, and it's surrounded in a way, and it's covered with a towel, but a big, part of it is covered in a way that makes it so clear that it's not insulation. Like, we wouldn't call that insulated because there's this big area that's open, right? In other words, so it's somewhat subjective, but it's someone like an outsider would have to say, this is not really insulation. So you could cover it on three sides, right? He says the majority of it can be covered as long as the significant part is not covered. And therefore, he says it's permitted to put toweling over an urn or pot of soup as long as a small but significant part of the urn or pot is left exposed. So it's a little bit subjective to know exactly what the right amount is, but it has to be something where someone would see it from the outside and say, you're not insulating over here, you're just covering it. We wouldn't call that insulation is when the whole thing is covered. You cover the whole thing and a little bit is peeping out, that's still insulation. But if it's a significant amount, everyone would say, oh, you're not. So certainly to take a towel and to put it on top of your chicken soup, right, and the sides are all covered, even though it's going over the edges, that's fine, because there's the whole bottom part, the whole bottom of the side is uncovered, that's not a problem. But if it's, if it's going down all the way and there's just a tiny little crack that's uncovered, that's probably, everyone would say, no, it is really insulated because it's really covered. So again, it's somewhat subjective, it's not such a clear thing, but certainly to put something on the top, even scraping over a little bit, that would not be problematic. Okay, so I think we have the principles, we'll review the principles, God willing, next week, and we'll go into more detail. Have a wonderful week. Okay.